I want to begin by explaining a bit about the difference between hearing and listening. Most people think that hearing and listening are the same thing, but hearing is really a passive function. Our ears could be seen as two microphones on either side of our heads, and our ears will pick up sounds. That's what they do. So that's very different than listening. Listening is a function of the mind. So listening is an active function versus hearing, which is a passive function. And listening involves desire and motivation and focus, and very much is a choice to listen. So if we choose to listen, we can also choose to not listen. And it's a question of whether we respond with our mind to sounds that come through our ears, or whether we block those sounds out. So someone who's good at listening is able to use the information they get from their ears and also discriminate which sounds that they will act upon and other sounds that they ignore. Our world is full of sound, and our bodies are also full of sound. So we are constantly bombarded with sound and noise. And so our whole bodies are like an antennae. We're like a human antenna. And so it's very important to listen and choose what we hear, because otherwise we would be rendered incapable by all the sounds that our ears are picking up all the time. You imagine a microphone. When you have a microphone on and you're not aware of it and you go and listen to that, it picks up the rough shuffling of people's feet. It picks up the hum of the refrigerator. It picks up the creaking of your elbow. It picks up maybe the sound of your breathing. And all those sounds can be and are overwhelming. So our ability to listen is crucial to use our brains optimally. So what does sound have to do with using your brain? Well, let's look a little bit at how the ear is constructed and how sound is received by our bodies. So the ear has three parts to it. It has the inner ear, the middle ear, and the outer ear. And the outer ear is the part that we can see, the actual physical structure of the ear. That's our outer ear. And some people have larger ears than others. Some people's ears come out further from their heads than others. And those people can amplify and pick up sounds more so than people with smaller ears. But that's the outer ear. I'll start with the inner ear. The inner ear has two parts to it. One is called the vestibule, and the other is called the cochlea. The vestibule is what we call the body ear and the movement ear, because sound is movement as well as it's just a question of, sound and movement are the same thing as a question of vibration. So the vestibule, or the part of the inner ear that picks up movement, controls movement and controls balance and coordination and equilibrium and controls every muscle of our bodies, is controlled by our inner ear. And it begins when you move from a horizontal position as an infant to a vertical position as a child. Well, there's two kinds of ways that we conduct sound. One through our bones and skin, and other through our, that's bone conduction, and then there's air conduction. And so the sounds that we pick up through the air come through our ears. The sounds that we pick up through our bones come through our bones. And vibrations we can pick up through our skin as well. So we actually listen with our whole bodies. And so the inner ear, it's very interesting because a child, until they're able to walk and stand, have little words. So the verticality of the body has to do with speaking. So prior to that, when a baby is horizontal, they don't have language until they can actually control their body and the movements of their body, which is the vestibule part of the ear. Then their body is in a position to receive sound through the air. And there are high frequencies and low frequencies of sound. It's a little complicated, but the low frequencies travel long distances and carry very little information. So there's a lot of vibration. The greatest example of low frequency is the elephants in the jungle, who are very heavy in their bodies. And when they stomp on the ground, other elephants can tell where they are, even from 2 miles away, just from the vibration that their bodies make on the earth. And so that's low frequency. It carries very little information, but it travels very far. And that low frequency has to do with our bones pick up a lot of low frequency, and vibrations are what we call low frequency. The high frequency travel very short distances but carry a lot of information, like the human voice. And so ultimately, listening has to do with speech and energizing the brain. Our ear acts as a human dynamo. And a dynamo, if you see them on bicycles, when you turn the pedals of the bicycle, the dynamo lights up the light by the movement of your feet on the pedals. And so the ear kind of transmits sounds into energy and feeds the brain. 80% of our brain food comes through our ears. So it lights up the brain, it energizes the brain, sound. And you can see this when you go to a rock concert and there's a lot of loud music, then it's very hard for your body not to move, because those are low frequencies that carry a lot of vibration, and the body part of the ear, the body ear, responds to those low frequencies. But what's important when it comes to speech and language and meaning and all those qualities that make us distinctly human come from the high frequencies. And the way the ear is built is that the cochlea, which has the receptors for high frequencies, there's more high frequencies in the cochlea than there are low. So that means that the higher frequencies energize the brain more than the low frequencies. People who suffer from depression often don't speak enough and don't speak to others enough. And they're very silent or solitary or sedentary, so they don't move their bodies either. And so that dynamo effect is not energizing their bodies and not energizing their brain, not creating the lifting of the mood, which comes from energy.
So what should they be doing?
The low energy causes that kind of depression. The human antennae is also a broadcaster, and so that broadcasting is the speaking element. So it's very important that we talk and that we hear our own speech, because it creates this loop. And when you talk, you're energized by the sound of your own voice. So part of the listening treatment therapy protocol is to speak through a microphone, so you begin to hear your own voice, and the brain is activated by the sound of even your own voice as well as other people's voices. Listening is an active function, so people who don't listen well have difficulty speaking. We speak with our ears. And so if there's trouble in speech communication, there's trouble with your ears and with listening. Now, there's the inner ear and the outer ear, but in between is the middle ear. And there's two muscles in the middle ear. And one of them is they're the smallest muscles in the body. But they are like the eardrum. They create tension. And what they do, if the muscles of the middle ear don't work well, then they don't block out unnecessary sounds and unwanted sounds. And so they act as a filter to keep out the sounds that would distract and help us to focus on the sounds that are important. So the listening therapy works with people who have poor muscle tone in their middle ear muscles. And as a result of that, people are hypersensitive to sound. Children on the autistic spectrum are often hypersensitive to sound. They can't block out sound. So if you can't block out sound, then you can, if someone runs a vacuum cleaner, they're in pain. Their ears are in pain because that sound is magnified, because the eardrum isn't modulating the sound and keeping it filtered so that it's at an acceptable level, because sound is very loud. And our bodies are not that big. And so if you have like intense decimals of sound that are getting complete access into your brain and your ear, you're going to be in pain, you're going to be in trouble. And so listening therapy has to do with how does the ear function and how to make it function optimally. And so that hypersensitivity can also come through your skin, because we hear with our skin, it's about vibration. And so people can be touch defensive, where their skin can't discriminate the sound and the vibration either. And so it's all overwhelming. And that hypersensitivity causes people to behave in ways that they aren't able to function very well. A child who's oversensitive to sound and to touch, they're going to not be able to learn very well. And the other thing that happens is that our bodies make sounds, like I said earlier, you know, the sound, imagine if you had to listen to the sound of your heartbeat all the time, and listen to your stomach gurgling all the time, and you can't block those sounds out. Those internal sounds are going to dominate your ability to take in any sound from the outside. Well, because listening is a choice, and it begins in the womb, which is one of the things Tomatis really established at a time when most people didn't believe that. Now it's kind of a well-known fact, but he was one of the pioneers that said that the ear is the first developed sense of all the senses in the womb, and that the infant can hear mother's voice. And if for whatever reason sounds are perceived as uncomfortable, as painful, too loud, then you can shut the ear down. The ear can crash, and you stop listening as a form of protection. And so you can't learn very well if you're not listening, and you can't communicate very well if you're not listening. And so you can have a learning difficulty. And then there's a whole relationship between sound and reading and sound and writing. And what's also primary is that vestibule, that inner ear part of the body ear. Think of it like a camera with a tripod. The body ear, the vestibule is like the tripod, and the camera is like the listening part, the hearing part, the sound part, high frequencies. So the low frequencies have to be strong, and that's posture. You have to keep your body against gravity and keep it stable before you can open your ears to hear what's out there. So the body ear, if you have low muscle tone, if you're not coordinated, if your balance is poor, your posture is poor, then you can't even stick your head up there to listen to the words that are out there for you to learn through or to communicate with. Well, Tomatis said that Mozart is a great mother. And he uses Mozart music and Gregorian chant. And he really analyzed all forms of music, all forms of classical music, and found out that Mozart had the highest concentration of high frequencies of sound. And I won't go into why that is, but indeed that is the case. So it's just a given that if you light up your brain, it'll function better, and you kind of correct the listening function, indeed, without having to analyze why you're not listening well. It's just a physiological way of giving the ear an aerobic workout.
And how's that done?
Well, it's done by the middle ear muscles, those two muscles. It's done by filtering sounds through something called the electronic ear. So the electronic ear is a way of feeding the ear with sounds that will nourish the ear. So it's a question of getting on a sound junk food diet as opposed to a sound superfood diet. And the high frequencies are like superfood to the ear and to the brain. And so what Tumatis does is he, first of all, looks at whether the bone conduction is higher than the air conduction. And if that's the case, then you're listening to the wrong sounds. The low frequency sounds are dominating, and there's not room for the higher frequencies to reach the brain and do its work. So that filtering retrains the ear to hear the high frequencies and let those pass, as opposed to the bone low frequencies dominating. People come to listening therapy for all different kinds of reasons. Tumatis started working with his father's friends who were all opera singers. His father was an opera singer in Italy. And so the opera singers were deafening their own ears by the sounds of their voices, because their voices had so much power and the decibels were so loud. It was the equivalent of an air jet taking off inside their bodies. So they were deafening themselves. And then they would come and say, I can't reach the notes that I need to reach anymore. And what Tumatis discovered, and at the time the traditional treatment was that you had to treat the throat. If a singer couldn't sing those notes, reach those notes anymore, it was something wrong with their larynx. But Tumatis discovered it was the ear. The ear wasn't hearing those notes anymore, so it couldn't reproduce them with the mouth. And so by reintroducing those frequencies and pushing through the blockage, it's a bit like a sound massage. When you have a massage, when the muscle is tense, you put a lot of pressure on it to cause it to relax. That's what a masseuse or a masseur does. And so what the filtered music does is it pushes through the blockages of sound and puts pressure on those, like applying pressure to the muscle, and the energy releases the blockages. It can also just be that you have a sensory processing disorder, and so you may have had a difficult birth, or you may have had a premature birth, and so your posture and your musculature and your body control of your body, your balance, your coordination, and using both sides of the body, and all those things as a result of illness or a developmental delay can cause then a child not to be able to speak or be delayed in their speech because the body ear is not functioning as it ought to.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
now there's also just downright trauma where a mother's voice, there might be violence in the home, there might be psychological reasons why an ear crashes.
So
Toxic sounds of negative emotions can cause the ear to crash, and the person will block those sounds out because they're painful sounds. Tumatis invented the electronic ear, and what he did was he would ask the person to record mother's voice, and then he would play mother's voice in the filtered music with Mozart. And so the ear would open up through the high frequencies and reintroduce mother's voice as a positive experience through the high frequencies of sound. And the person wouldn't necessarily automatically hear that, but eventually they could hear that they were listening to mother's voice all along, but through Mozart's filter. And so then the child learns to listen to mother's voice in a positive way. It's a process, and it's a physiological way of getting the body to work through the blockages that it has and to function as it was designed to function. With regards to trauma, one way that the Tumatis method would help with someone who experiences trauma is that it addresses the fight-flight reaction of the body, the sympathetic nervous system versus the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the calming, organizing part of the body. And so he introduces the Gregorian chant as a way to regulate breathing, because the singers, when they chant, they have a calmness and a certain rhythm and sequencing to their breath as they sing. And so when you listen to Gregorian chant through the electronic ear, often people will fall asleep. And these are people that may have difficulty resting and difficulty sleeping. And others will become calm and become more receptive, just because they're not so anxious and nervous. Because when you live in trauma, often that anxiety level never goes away, and you're always in a fight-flight reaction. Your body is in, I've got to either run away from something or I've got to fight. And that means that adrenaline is pumping through your body more or less all the time. Listening to the music can reduce that anxiety through the music. And you want to get to a place where you're in more of a parasympathetic nervous system response, which is calming and organizing. And those are both are unconscious, but you want to get to a level where you can begin to reduce the anxiety and raise that focused, calm, listening posture that enables you to make choices and see what your choices are and be more open to other people and to the world that you're living in.